All right, so hi, my name is Nadine Youssef. I am one of the organizers who helped to make this. I am with the Marlboro Peaceful protesters, and this is hopefully going to be the first episode in multiple in our new web series called Dare to Know. I first off would like to thank Aaron Jones for all of his hard work. He really came through with everything he did for this event. He was so helpful, and I really want to thank him. And I want to thank from the panelists who took their time out of their very busy schedules to come and speak at this event. I very much appreciate it. I'm going to be giving a small presentation right now about stereotypes and really common stereotypes we have within society. And afterwards, the panelists are going to debate. And afterwards, there will be a Q&A. So during the event, if you want to send in your questions in the chat box, you may. All right, so let's begin. It's just a joke, breaking stereotypes. What are stereotypes? First, we need to define what a stereotype is. A stereotype is an oversimplified image or idea about a group of people. They're usually negative because they make a particular group of people the butt of the joke. But they can be very positive. For example, when you think of a judge, we imagine a smart, sober, unbiased, and trustworthy person within society. But even positive stereotypes can still be dangerous because they may make members feel as if they must live up to some high expectation. And major issues of stereotypes is that they oversimplify. It causes us to ignore the differences of individuals and leads to generalizations. This creates a social categorization that helps to enable prejudices and mentalities based on us and them. And it's easy to simply say that they're just jokes, but these jokes not only rely on major psychological and political And it's easy to simply say that they're just jokes, but these jokes not only rely on others' miseries, but they have also shown to have major psychological and political effect on those people. One big effect stereotypes have are stereotype threats, which are internal and unconscious behaviors that affect how one handles evaluations, performances, exams, and so on, because of their fear of misrepresenting their group. Basically, that just means people may be so afraid due to the stigma surrounding their group, their performance on different tasks may be affected. Research done by Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson, for example, showed that African Americans at Stanford University did worse on a challenging verbal test in comparison to white students when they believed the exam was a measure of their abilities. Stereotype threats are so impeding on the mind, they can even affect white men. When white men with near perfect scores in mathematics on the SAT were told that their scores would be used to see why Asian students were so much more advanced in the math fields, their scores were considerably low. And this doesn't just affect ethnicities. More research has shown that women and even athletes do worse on examinations when they believe the results will represent their abilities as women or athletes. So, for example, if a woman in power is afraid of being indecisive and misrepresenting women as a whole, she may become so afraid of making a misstep that in the end she does become indecisive because of her thought process being so clouded and preoccupied. But these studies also have shown that when participants were told that the evaluations had no reflection on their abilities and were more or less just learning tools, the gaps between groups of people were almost non-existent. This shows how dangerous the effect stereotypes can be on one's psyche, that to fail in any degree will be detrimental to the entirety of their people and will enforce the idea that it is their fault for it. So now we're going to talk about some very common but harmful stereotypes that are still seen today. One is that Black children grow up without fathers. The CDC conducted research that monitored different aspects of households from 2006 to 2010. The data showed that most Black children, about 2.5 million, grew up with their fathers in the household as compared to 1.7 million who did not. This, however, does not mean they did not have a father in their life. The study also showed that Black men are the most involved in their children's lives as compared to all other primary races and ethnicities, regardless if they do or do not reside within the household. Now, with information like this, how can the stereotype be so prevalent? It is due in part to how the data is recorded. They utilize only marital and housing status to determine if a house has a father. They omit from their data men who have died, divorced couples, unmarried couples who live in the same home, and any men who are currently incarcerated or who are unable to live within their home because of a past incarceration. This bias, ironically, is not reported when researching white men, including those who have adopted children or who are divorced, where, interestingly enough, the divorce rate among white men is 40%. This allows misconceptions to surface about Black families and affects them on a judicial level. In issues involving court cases, adoptions, joint custodies, Black men will be seen as untrustworthy providers, and a judge may be less likely to grant leniency in these cases. And perhaps worst of all, it continues to circulate the disgusting idea that Black men are dangerous and unnecessary in society, especially with the notion that they can't even help their own families. Another horrible stereotype is that Hispanic immigrants steal jobs and ruin the economy. Brookings Institute did research in 2017 on immigrants' effect on the economy and found that many take undesirable jobs, jobs that most Americans already refused to take. So they're not stealing jobs, they're taking jobs that were already there and no one wanted. And this includes primarily physical demanding jobs like gutting fish or farm work. Immigrants, in fact, help in the process of job hirings because if the workforce is able to grow at a steady pace, then it helps the economy to grow. And as of 2018, immigrants only accounted for about 40% of the general US workforce, which equates to about 2.4 million jobs out of the 155.76 million in the US. These ideas may be so prevalent, though, because of stereotypes perpetuated by the US government. During World War II, the US relied heavily on Hispanic immigration for work as soldiers or in US jobs, even creating government programs like the US Mexican Farm Labor Program, in which Hispanic immigrants came to the US on a temporary basis in exchange for pay and fair treatment. But in 1955, once World War II had ended, the government decided they no longer wanted these immigrants. And in one of the largest mass deportation of undocumented workers in US history, the government deported roughly 1.3 million immigrants, some even being US citizens, in a racistly named procedure dubbed Operation Wetback. The government relied on military tactics in order to deport these people and used racially charged stereotypes to justify what they were doing. The creative frontage of Hispanic immigrants, and to quote History.com, they were seen as dirty, disease-bearing, and irresponsible people. Our treatment of immigrants has not only destroyed the image of America, but has also shown that Americans so easily forget history. That though the first immigrants in America were the British, we try to find some justification in our disgusting abuse of them, even with all the help they have given us. And the last stereotype I want to talk about is Muslim women are oppressed by the hijab. So the purpose of the hijab is for Muslim women to maintain modesty and privacy from unrelated males. The hijab does not apply to just women. Men also have their own form of hijab in which they need to be dressing modestly. And the big thing about the hijab is that it's supposed to be a choice between a woman to get closer to her religion and closer to Allah, which means God. The hijab actually has helped women to feel safe and strengthen themselves. Because in a lot of war-torn countries like Afghanistan and Iraq, these women are constantly afraid of rape or being just attacked by soldiers. And to have coverings that may make them appear as quote unquote undesirable gives them a level of protection they haven't felt before. The issue of the hijab began in the late 19th and 20th century when European countries like Italy, France, and Britain began to occupy the Middle East. And many of them encouraged women to abandon the headscarf and start acting more like European women. Now, some Middle Eastern countries tried to combat these European rules by appearing more modern, but this included adopting laws and policies that specifically played into European standards. Like, for example, Turkey banned the headscarf in 1980 after a coup, and the headscarf ban was not lifted until October of 2013. Today, the hijab has become a symbol of feminism as both a status of oppression and power, depending on who's viewing it. It's an incredibly debated topic, one that has little to do with a Muslim woman's choice and more so on what everyone else believes her choice should be. And there's one final note I want to make, and it's that stereotypes may appear to be nothing more than tasteless jokes and just something harmful that like anyone can make around at like the water cooler at work or at school or whatever, but they truly are harmful. within a society, and they perpetuate the same racist ideas that they were established on. In one of the most diversified times in American history, we cannot accept stereotypes as everyday humor or comedy for us to laugh at. We must begin to ask ourselves why these stereotypes exist, why they are dangerous, and what can be done to stop them. And that's the end of it. So I hope you guys enjoy that. Thank you so much.
That was phenomenal, Nadine. Thank you so much for the intro as well, and for really setting the tone for this panel discussion. I will function as the moderator. Oh, wait, one moment. There we go. Okay. I will function as the moderator. My name is Aaron Thomas Jones. A little bit about me. I am a graduate of Rutgers University, Newark. I have a bachelor's, master's, and associates in criminal justice. I love it. It is my life. And I am the founder of the OPC, and I am a brother of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. And for this first part, I'd like the panelists to introduce themselves. So let's start with the great Kevin Michael Slater.
Hi there, I'm Kevin Michael Slater. I own a consulting firm called Labyrinth Group, as well as I do work internationally and nationally on diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging with major corporations, universities, governments, and coaching of private individuals to end racism and anti-racism work.
Thank
Been
you
doing that for over 40 years.
Thank you for being here. And up next, Justin Artinet.
Good evening, everyone, and happy Sunday. My name is Justin Artinet. I am currently a grant administrator in the school district of Asbury Park. I'm in Asbury Park, New Jersey. I'm also a brother of Phi Beta Sigma Fraternity Incorporated. And in the fraternity realm, I am the first vice president of my chapter, as well as the state director of education for New Jersey. So looking forward to a great conversation, everyone.
And up next, Freddie Davis, the third.
Hello, everybody. My name is Freddie. I'm a paralegal in the city of Orange Township. I'm also an Alpha, just like Aaron, and I studied philosophy in school at the University of Chicago.
Awesome, awesome. And Horner Williams.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Horner Williams. I'm a graduate of Tufts University near Boston and Rutgers Business School in Newark, New Jersey. I'm also a brother of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. I work in accounting in New York City, and I'm a father of 3 and a husband of nearly 30 years.
Thank you for your time today. And I think it is like going off of what Nadine showed us. Let's like jump right into this. And this is for anybody to take once they feel it. What has the role of stereotypes been throughout history? And could you explain the development and role today, and maybe where you see it in your line of work?
Well, one of the things that stereotype does is it lies a passive, aggressive methodology of learning. We use stereotypes to decide everything from a bad wine to a bad day at work to a good day. We use stereotypes to justify behavior. We use stereotypes to make laws. Stereotypes ever since we had Birth of a Nation in the United States, slavery, from Jezebel to the Jigaboo, all are still perpetrated to this day in a continuous chain that every time we try to interrupt it, it becomes right back again. I had a great uncle who was a Sigma, who actually helped to protect the last of the Black school systems in the South. And they built new buildings just before integration, and then they kidnapped him, killed him, and put him in the trunk of his car. He taught me that the one thing a stereotype can do is you can have as much education as you want. I've got 2 masters, an MBA, I've been a dean, and one child, one paper boy can call you a nigger and change the perception of how you're seen by everyone else. That stereotype, that little thing that someone learns passively from the grandfather that buys them ice cream or the grandmother that makes them pie, perpetuates for 401 years.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to just say I completely agree, and I think that you know, the stereotypes have historically been used as vehicles to stagnate cultures. Not only that, people have used stereotypes to try to figure out who they are in the society of the unknown, right? So stereotypes have this weird, ambiguous kind of figure that people kind of use to kind of mold themselves into, or to mold other people into, in order to fit into whatever type of microcosm they're working towards, right? And at this point, stereotypes are something that we make fun of. We joke about them, and we use them in a very lighthearted way. When in this time specifically, we need to make sure that we're looking and making sure that we're checking ourselves and these microaggressions that will continue to plague our people. So stereotypes have their place, but it's also time for us to have the conversation about how we can make sure that this conversation doesn't continue in the next 20 to 30 years.
So with that, throughout history, there have been people who have gone beyond the stereotypes, right? So how can we say that it is that they are as powerful as they are, that they can destroy these communities? How do we say that it's not just the people, when people like W.E.B. Du Bois, even Booker T. Washington, came up from this time where stereotypes must have been berated and there was no law to protect them from it? How do we combat that?
One of the important things about stereotypes is that so they help form a culture's ideology. And what I mean by that is, like, every society in general is just going to have this idea that they are just, for the most part. Like, most of society will believe that, broadly speaking, the society that they live in is just, or else that's how you start getting revolutions, you know? When people start thinking that, hey, this society isn't fair, isn't all right. So the reason why stereotypes are especially dangerous by keeping that in mind is when you see things that you might consider injustices. So, like, let's, for example, use like racial disparities, the racial income inequality. Stereotypes are what people use to back that up. Like, oh, like Black people have poor home ownership because they don't know how to take care of their neighborhoods, you know, because they're criminal, things of that nature. So the reason why stereotypes are really dangerous in the broad social concepts isn't because, like, individuals can overcome them, and, like, sometimes it'll hurt an individual's feelings. Is because it's used to justify existing oppression.
I agree with Freddie on that. But one of the things that we keep missing sometimes is how it's a competitive notion. So in the United States, there are about 108 stereotypes from the 1600s to the 1800s. In those stereotypes, we then build new constructs. Those new constructs then divide people into being white. White becomes the benchmark. So you got people who are ethnic that went through their stereotypical years, the immigrant years, then they get cleansed into some artificial construct of whiteness. That becomes the archetype, right down from becoming to where you go to school, like the places I went. Some of them were extraordinarily white, like Washington University and Dartmouth, and to right down to where you live, the gated community. Each one of them has some notion of, in order to be, you need to live like this in order to be better. So it becomes a competitive notion about it that actually in the 1940s and 50s, Italians were not white. You know, Jewish Americans were not considered white. And every time the census is taken, a new group gets added to the possibility of a new majority. So you have to even look at the construct of race as made up to still be a power continuum. And the stereotypes help generate that power.
You know, this idea of, like, race as a social construct, and which I agree with, I will put that out there right now. I do agree with that. How do we grow from it if through through our oppression, through African American, Muslim Americans, through everybody's oppression, they've gained an identity through that race, through this social construct, but they want equality, like we want equality in spite of that social construct. So what's the middle ground, right? Where where do we stop it from being a social construct, and then where is it a part of our identity?
So you don't have to be a race realist to realize that like you don't have to believe that like race is something like biologically constructed to think that it has you know, real like plays a real role in people's lives. Like the fact that like people who believe that race is a social construct, like people hear social construct and it's been so overused, people think it means imaginary or like, you know, not very, or something that doesn't have effect. But like plenty of things are social constructs that are, you know, things that you really have to contend with in your daily life. Like government is obviously a social construct. That's not something that exists. But you know, if you want, like, if you stop paying your taxes, government, that same social construct will come to your door and arrest you. So people, I think that's like sort of the argument, because I know you're just saying that like, you're just asking that question for educational purposes, so it's not like directed at you, but like that's sort of the argument you have to take, because sometimes we just don't do enough job, like we don't disagree with the premises of questions we're asked enough. And you know, like if I was more prepared to answer this question, I would have figured out a way to connect that back to stereotypes, because I feel like a lot of the reasons why stereotypes are like affect our lives so much is because we don't even question the very idea of like, you know, like we don't question all the beliefs that we hold and why we hold them.
Well, Freddie, you start out with them as the things to disprove. So the difficulty about a stereotype is that even as a small child, you don't even know half of it. I didn't know that eeny, meeny, mo was pick a nigga by the toe. When I grew up in my black neighborhood in New Jersey, was pick a tiger by the toe.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you go to another neighborhood in the same geographic area, and then the stereotype about you comes about with little black Sambo and pancakes and tigers, and you're not smart enough to figure something out, but yet you're an A student, there's a conflict between how you're grown at home, and that's when the code switching begins. So part of it, I think, is that we become defensive early. Do we ever get to be children that just play? Or do we get told early on, you can't go stand on the corner because you'll get in trouble and shot. You can't go here because they won't want you to be there. Those stereotypes also make rules that can give you the trauma, the long-term trauma of just trying to be human, and then add on the stereotypes.
If I could add to that really quickly, a couple of notes. I think that, again, one of the definite ways to kind of, I think one of your questions was how do we find a middle ground? I think that the idea of a middle ground is so interesting in context to, you know, humanity versus what we're perceived as, right? But I think that something that we can do specifically as the Black culture, right? And I'll put that specificity on there, is by exposure. You know, again, I work with students and I work in the out of school and after school time frame, and you'd be surprised what taking a student to a museum can do for their thought process, right? Being able to come out of where you normally sit, and if you're sitting in a space where there's despair and there's just fighting and gang activity and drug use and food insecurity and homelessness, you don't know what to expect because there's nothing for you to look at. Right. So exposure. And that's why having these organizations and organizations like yours, Aaron, and like the fraternities and sororities, that it's their job to go ahead and put people in places to be able to do this. I think that we have to figure out and understand that the middle ground is some space that we have to create at this point, because it's literally been polar. It's been either you're, as I got when I was growing up, you're talking white or you're a hoodlum. Like there is no in between. So that's my take on it.
I think.
Oh, go ahead.
I think when I think of stereotypes too, I think they're constantly being disrupted. I think that people say segregationists when they saw Jackie Robinson come to play baseball. I think they realized it would be some time, but I see that as the beginning of the end. Obviously, if you don't allow us to play baseball, you're never going to make it to the White House. And I see the beginning of that journey really with Jackie Robinson, because somebody's going to root for him. Somebody's going to wear his jersey. Next thing you know, you're going to have to work with these people. You're going to be, fraternizing with them. They're going to be your neighbor. They're going to be in your schools. They're going to be on your television set. You're going to see them like people. Your son or daughter might be, romantically involved with them. And before you know it, whammo, they're the governor or they're the mayor or they're the president. Or when I saw, for example, in recent years, you see Martha Stewart going to prison. That's impossible that would have happened 30 or 40 years ago. That's impossible. Like there was a small girl at the high school where my daughter goes, small white girl. She called in some kind of a threat to the school. Little white girl, they pulled her out of the school. You can't go to school here anymore, ever. You're done. One time, one shot deal. Nothing happened, didn't have a weapon, simply made a phone call. If a little white girl did that in the 80s or 90s, that would have been blown over. Now, if I had done it in the 80s or 90s, that would have been different. And I would have expected the outcome to be different. But it looks like these stereotypes are constantly being disrupted.
I have to go with Brother Williams on the disruption, because it's got to deconstruct to reconstruct. And even though we may not think there's progress, one of my clients the other day was coaching as an executive female in Washington. And she was saying, is there any progress? And I said, well, let's look at it this way. When I was born in 1958, and when you were born in the 60s, this conversation was impossible. Now this conversation is our standard method of operation. Progress is in inches, but it's a constant deconstruction and reconstruction. We had 8 years of construction, and now we've had 3.5 years of deconstruction, where people will take apart the notions of building. So it's a constant refilling the backpack, changing allies, identifying new processes, but most of all, not this time. This generation has finally said in a nice way, I'm not my grandparents, but it's not because they weren't strong. They gave me enough fortitude to say, son, you go on, and my daughter, you go on, and you make sure not again.
I love this conversation, and I wanna move it to where that deconstruction and reconstruction happen in our society. So like when thinking of, and by that I mean socialization, and when thinking about like the three forms or where the three places that socialization happen, which is the criminal justice system, the education system, and the family, what do you think the reasons are that stereotypes are so commonplace in households, and does the feedback loop start there, or is that just a place on its journey?
That's a great question, and just to start off, I know that the panelists probably have a bunch to pick at there, but I would honestly answer that the stereotypes in the household are reinforced there for sure, specifically depending on who you're around in your family, and honestly, sometimes being in those stereotypes and being stereotypical is safe for families, right? Because you don't have to move outside of that thought process. You don't have to move outside of someone's expectation. That's why when we have these exceptions to the rule, i.e. Black men that graduate, Black women that graduate, or go to college, it's seen as, oh my goodness. But the problem is the fact that that's seen as the exception to the rule, right? So honestly, bringing down the stereotypes to a basic function is something that's difficult to do, because the source of it, yes, although it is racially very insensitive for most, it's honestly safe for others. So you really have to kind of pull at which space you want to kind of lend yourself to, because even sometimes as an educated Black man, it's fun to go and just do stuff that, all right, let me go ahead and crack open this grape soda and eat the chicken, right? It feels like, all right, I'm doing my culture justice by being able to do this and not have to fit into this box. But the box in and of itself is a thought process, and that's something that we have to kind of move beyond, honestly.
Justin, you bring up an important point. We were communal to begin with, even though we were 400 slammed together plus communities and everything. And you just could land it somewhere like, I don't know you don't know my language, but we seem to be in this enslavement together, so let's figure it out. But the communalism has this responsibility and consequentialism. You know, this notion of, I have to think about who I represent when I go outside. You know, I have to think about who I am when I leave the barbershop. I have to think about what I say before I say it. I have to think about my code switching. I have to think, because it reflects on not just me, my son, my mom, my brother, you. There's a reflection. We don't live in a society that shares that value. We live in a society when we have these conversations about stereotypes, thus, well, as an individual, it was just a joke. I was just talking. I don't know that group. You don't know me. And individualism seems to be a comfortable switch to flip back off and on versus the ownership of a community. If we like it or not, there's a certain amount of lift to that having a community gives you a little sense of, we can make it. Our biggest stereotype is 200%. Each of you at one time or another heard, be 200%. Whatever they're doing out there, you need to be better than that 2 times. Whereas in Spike Lee's movie, Ossie Davis says, do the right thing. And we constantly are with that once again, I'm going back to that childhood thing of just being crushed into a position. And therefore, just like Nadine's research showed, your idea of failure is fragile. It's very, very fragile. The normal trial and error is almost freezing you into a point that movement becomes hard, and every movement has to be over-evaluated.
Sorry. So thank you so much. And when we're talking about this, I know it was in the house of the family. How do you think that this, like, what is the moment on that loop of criminal justice, education, and family? So after that, after we were put into these boxes, what is the role of school in either packing them down? Let me change how I say that. What is the role of school in reaffirming those stereotypes and reaffirming your beliefs? And then what is the role of criminal justice in that as well?
Whoa.
Wait, Justin, if you don't mind, if I can
No,
jump
please,
in.
yeah, that's a
So, finally, I
please.
know somewhere, and probably if I had to guess, if hopefully the man is still alive, but somewhere in like the mountains of Italy, like a philosophy professor of mine, Arnold Davidson, is like smiling down on me because so when I hear things of like family, schools, and criminal justice system, like there's this one guy, Michel Foucault, who people who know me like know that I can really not stop talking about this dude, but he wrote a system of philosophy. He wrote his philosophy that really serves to connect like these essentially what he calls like bases of power. And so one of the reasons why you know, we find that these forms of socialization, as like we're put in the question, contribute to stereotypes is because they're like sources of power. And like being a Frenchman, he followed Francis Bacon's idea of like knowledge is power. So when you go to school and you see like all these different people, like, you know, Justin has used the word like exposure before. Like there's a certain, like no matter where you go to school, you're being exposed to something, even if that something is, you know, almost a type of emptiness. Like your family is the people who first give you like your ideas, and so your ideas of how society should be structured in a way comes from like your first ideas, at least come from your upbringing and your family. And then finally, the most obvious point of power in all of this is the criminal justice system. And so I think that that is a little bit, that's sort of a little bit harder for us to get into, like, you know, because I've never really dealt with the criminal justice system that closely, like only really police. But it just, Foucault has this idea. I'm not really going to get into it because I haven't completely read the book he says it in, to be honest. But he has this idea that the family, like such as the house structure in schools, are structured to look like prisons, because he read one thing by Jeremy Bentham, and Jeremy Bentham was like, this is how we should structure our society. It's the panopticon. The Atlantic actually just released an article about the panopticon. That's all right. That's enough of me fanboying about Foucault. But I really have this question because it brings back memories of like college, and also it's really relevant to like some of my favorite writers.
You brought up an important point that really deals with how the school system now is structured almost like a prison. There's actually a study out of Berkeley where this brother named Chancellor actually did a study that we can predict from the 3rd grade when someone's going to prison. That study already exists. Now, in order for that to be true, there has to be a systematic path to that. There has to be an acknowledgement of what someone has said, this child can't grow and go. And so part of the difficulty is, and if we go all the way back to slave hunters and needing ID just to go from one place to another, you have been on a structured system of control for 400 years. The family used to be a village construct. You know, whatever kid was running around would be fed. Whatever kid got hurt, somebody kissed the knee and washed it off. If you fell asleep in a pile of kids, they slept in a pile of kids. And fortunately or unfortunately, that still existed even in the 60s and the 70s, where somebody would ask, did you eat? Come on in, sit down and do that. Then we removed men from the home. Then we made sure that if you were broke, you couldn't take a dime if there was a man around. And then we made sure that wherever men were, that they were demasculated by the behaviors that they were put through in prison. And then people told you that your fathers were no good and that you would never be anything. And yet, with all of that, Nadine's statistics, we rose. So the stereotypes can also challenge you not to be that guy. Most of the young Black men I know, from talking to my son's friends at Morehouse when he was there, or my other son, all his friends from Guilford, we would sit down and talk about all the things we didn't want to be. We would talk about all the things we can be. And I know in my fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha, just like other Greek fraternities, we talk about all the things we should be. So it's very important to talk about, even though these stereotypes are here, just like Maya Angelou talks about Still I Rise, we spend a lot of energy, unfortunately, on not being the stereotype.
That, oh, did somebody?
If you have a quick quote, I'll jump in, you can. I was gonna say, first of all, yes, that was, you know, you grow up with the examples of what not to be, and you're working so hard to run away from that, that in the midst of that, you don't deal with anxiety, you don't deal with stress, you don't know how to cope properly because you're taught that whatever that is, run from that. And even though that has some things that may be attractive to you because of your environment, it's not the way to go. And I was going to also mention, you know, in talking about specifically the educational system, that Paulo Freire wrote a book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And he wrote it specifically because he wanted to talk about how oppression begets this banking versus problem posing thought process, right? Banking being the space where you literally just pour stuff into a child, you pour stuff into them because that's all that you know. Whereas problem posing is something that you just decide to go ahead and figure out, and you do it almost from a problem-based learning scenario, right? But what happens in specifically communities of color that are having issues with accessing this type of education, they don't have the resources, the school buildings, or even the professional teachers that will be able to handle what they're looking to do in those classrooms. I'm so happy that I get to work in an environment with educators that not only care about the curriculum that's being taught, but they care about teaching to the whole child, right? Similarly, if we look at the criminal justice system, specifically policing, right? You have people that are working in this community that aren't from the community. So when you have people that are basically going against anything that they know to go to work every day, of course they're going to be defensive. Of course they're going to see the things that they see in the news and they see it play out in front of them. They're going to react in certain ways. Is it okay? Absolutely not. But it is our reality. Similar to, and again, to the education system where we have these youngest teachers coming out of their coursework, going into the worst neighborhoods and expecting to teach these students and be effective in these classroom spaces. That's how teachers become traumatized. And then in 20 or 30 years, those are the same teachers that are tenured and burnt out and don't care, right? So when we think about how we want to kind of bring these three, criminal justice, the household, and education, into this kind of conversation, you have to realize that there are systems in place that are honestly used to keep people of color in the space that they need some resources that are only available in these areas. And again, we can talk about all of this and break this down as we need to, but I think it's just interesting that, you know, we're able to kind of quote these fantastic philosophers and these educators that are well before their times, but we're still not able to solve any of the issues that they gave us answers for. It's sitting right here. But of course, you know, the people perish because of a lack of knowledge. And specifically in our school systems, working in one, it is just specifically with this time where students that would normally be one grade level behind anyway in a regular school year have not been in a classroom since March. You better believe there are going to be years of issues that come from, not just because of their educational regression, but also because of the fact that they were home with their stressful families. Their parents don't know how to work technology when we're actually in a virtual world. Like, these are all things that we have to begin to consider when talking about these systems that are put in place to protect us, but are also put in place to put people to work. So we have to figure out, what do we care more about? And I think that's where this conversation may lead to at some point.
And I just want to mention Black Power, the book by Kwame Ture. And I may be pronouncing his name wrong. I apologize. But he talks about the role of African Americans in America, and it is that of a colony. And the role of the colony is to produce like this, it's an economic front to bring we need this workforce, and you can tailor that workforce. You can tailor what Black people are doing based on the social pressures that you apply to them. And did any of the panelists have anything else on this subject? We can keep going. I have one more question, and I promise we can snap back.
It's just one thing that you pointed out, is that we're a commodity. And when I used to teach at St. John's in African American Studies and Black Studies, my first class, I would always go, what would you do if your refrigerator talked back to you? You know, what happens if your refrigerator doesn't want to freeze your ice cream or chill your beer? And my students would go, well, you unplug it. I said, this is what's happening to African Americans. When you are bought like chattel, the entire factor is, how do I control the property that I bought? And escaping to humanness, to singularity when we mix with machines, is a very long journey. Our biggest argument, even in Stereotypes, is trying to prove we're human. We're the original aliens.
Oh my God. That hurt. I won't lie.
Yeah, I have a real quick point just to interject on that. Building on what was just said. It was kind of crazy when I heard it. And this was a devout segregationist, and he told you that he was coming from that point. And during a panel discussion like this, and it says, for me to recognize a Black person, a Black man, a Black family, or to celebrate their life, or to want to get to know them, would be like McDonald's, giving the cows any credit for building the business. So he compared Black people literally to cows, not even human, just, literally meaningless.
So I'm gonna interject before my next question, because this is compelling. When I hear that, right, and this is me with 6 years of education. I'm sure other people with informal education will also feel the same way. I'm almost instantly filled with rage, right? So then there's this component, and if I'm like the exception, so be it. But how do we combat, and Justin, I believe you were talking about this too, how do we combat that, our own rage, and not fulfill the stereotypes of the angry Black man to fix the world, or the angry Black woman, which we know is pervasive and very extremely detrimental?
I think the Gen Zs have figured it out. They stopped caring about what people think about them. That I think that, honestly, that is what people, we're at a point where we can have these conversations, and it's specifically, my mother is a fantastic human being, but she's actually writing her doctoral work on what the angry Black woman historically has been and why this concept is so just detrimental to even the thought process of the Black community as a whole. The matriarch of what we are and who we've come to be is being belittled to angry. Yeah, let's do it. So I think that when we have a conversation about perception specifically, Black men and Black women have mastered being able to code switch. So perception is literally depending on what the situation is that I'm dealing with at the moment. Because if I'm at a Wawa and I have to cuss somebody out because they threw a sandwich on the counter to me, unlike they would pass it to their white counterpart, versus me being in the office space and dealing with something much more egregious and still having to keep my composure, I think that we have to figure out how to tote that line of, I'm not, like you said, Aaron, I'm not going to betray who I am just because the reaction that you want right now is something that will give you gratification and saying, oh, well, of course. Well, there it is, right? And so, like I said, I think the Gen Zs have figured it out.
You figured it out, but I also think, I watched Black is King yesterday and watch it bust through again. Just taking our ancestors and moving forward. And everybody might disagree with me, but we need constantly to remind ourselves that this is not all we are.
Yeah.
We got to constantly remind ourselves that anger is unrequited pain. Anger is long-term trauma. This is multi-generational trauma. But somehow you got to remember that it energizes us to not lay down. Somehow you got to remember every gospel song, every blues song, every jazz moment, every time you saw somebody cooning, that you decided, nah, we can't keep doing that. That it energized you. So yeah, as the Hulk once said, yeah, I'm angry, but I just manage it better than you do.
All right.
I'm angry all the time, but I just manage it better. I can't turn green every day. I gotta pick those battles.
All right. So for our next question in our next section, it is about entertainment and entertainment. We know that it is crazy. We know that they use stereotypes to push certain narratives and just to make money. But what is the responsibility of that industry in combating these harmful stereotypes? Do they have a role to play in fighting stereotypes, or should it just be entertainment? Watch what you watch.
I mean, I personally think that the entertainment industry absolutely does have a responsibility. Whether or not they admit it or like follow up on that responsibility is like completely different. But I do think that they have a responsibility for fighting stereotypes, if not for just the simple reason of, especially with how, sort of diverse the industry is already right now. They sort of owe it to themselves. Like, people shouldn't take parts where they know that, like this idea of like, for example, I always think back to black exploitation, and I'm always wondering, like, so what should I think as like, this like sort of amateur critique, like what should I think of this moment in like, especially like specifically Black culture's history, like Black exploitation, like, they were doing a lot of things that like essentially were about stereotypes that today we think are pretty nasty and wouldn't really agree with or want portrayed. But back then they were and even to this day they're cult classics. And I think it's a little bit different because at least like those movies were Black funded and Black created. But when you look at like say a Tarantino movie and you see the same motifs and you see the same like, and you see these references, you have to really have an eye on him and really thoroughly critique him so that you can keep those references pure and make sure that the stereotype doesn't just get lost into something meaningless and therefore harmful.
Contextuality is also still about critical mass. we haven't had enough volume or body of work that every piece of work we have has to be taken seriously. You know, we're going to argue about the power of Tyler Perry, to Michaud's work with black and white in the early days, to Dolomite, to coffee. And as a 14-year-old to see somebody kick somebody's ass at the Adams Theater in Newark or the Paramount, that's the best we could do with $1 back in those days. It was just entertainment. And white people weren't looking at it. It became a stereotype when a Tarantino, like Freddie's saying, decided to borrow from the genre. So we have family moments and we have friends moments and we have enemy moments. You know, there are times when we looked at The Color Purple as a book and loved it, but we didn't want to see it on the screen, a man beating a black woman's ass. You know, the thing about consequentialism is we got to own the good, the bad, and the ugly, but we have to have a big enough body of work that we're allowed to be full artists all the way across the board. And hip hop kind of broke that a little bit. You know, West Coast, East Coast, there's a lot of different types of hip hop. I don't have to agree with them all, but I agree they all have a right to exist.
And so, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, and also, you know, and listen, those are fantastic, you know, examples. But I think, and again, I'm coming from the working in the education field, you know, the entertainment changes, so everything becomes so obsolete in the next 2 or 3 months, right? And then what ends up happening is there are these generational gaps of those who watch Good Times versus those who watch Flavor of Love. Do you see what I'm saying? So when you compare the conversations, what ends up happening is students and people in general are attracted to what they're going to be attracted to, and especially if it comes on TV, especially if those people look like them. And I think that that's something that we have to be careful of and not just mulling over, because there was a time where we weren't represented in media or in entertainment at all. So now that we are in full force, one can question and ask whether or not this is the proper representation, or what is the proper representation, or is this the proper representation of what's going on in our communities? Again, I have students that can tell me what happened on Love and Hip Hop from scene to scene, but can't give me their 2 times tables, right? So like, there's a conversation that has to happen about, well, what is more important? And if what's on TV and what's in entertainment is more important, that's something that we need to focus on. But what ends up happening is we end up selling our thought process, selling our rights, selling our materials and our scripts, and then they end up being changed into what sells. And unfortunately, what sells is 2 people fighting in the middle of a bar randomly about someone's ex-husband. Like, that's just what is important to people, right? And we have to make sure that we're and be able to interject and have conversations like this. And what I will say about this time specifically is that this time, for me specifically, even on social media, I've been able to see an explosion of consciousness that I've not ever seen. And I was born in the time where I was born in 91. So in high school, I had MySpace. So I was at the time where social media and stuff and entertainment was collaborating and building a conglomerate of thought process that catered directly to me. So now that we're here, and now that my generation of people are turning 30, Jesus Christ, we're turning 30, we have to be able to have the conversation about how do we make sure that we're still responsible? Because, and this all goes back, I'm finishing, I promise. This all goes back to the family, right? I knew in my household, if there was something that couldn't be watched on TV, it just wasn't watched on TV, right? And then at some point when I got older and was paying for it myself, I can understand that, okay, this is why she don't want me watching this, but I have the guilty pleasure of watching it. But as a child, you have these confines of what am I being told? What's being put on TV versus what's happening in my regular life. And if what's happening on TV interests you more, you're going to begin to do those things because you want to revolt against what you're actually living, right? So it has a very big influence on not just children, but people in general, because a lot of people, older, younger, young in age, and young at heart, they look to our entertainment sources to get some type of relaxation and some laughs out of this really serious time that we're in. So I think now more than ever, we have to figure out how people, specifically in entertainment, can use their platforms to push really positive messages and messages of unity at this point. Because I'm tired of getting, do I approve of the Donald Trump ads on my YouTube, where we can be talking about how come Breonna Taylor's assaulters have not been captured yet. Again, like, these are conversations that we can begin having, but it takes conversations like this to begin to push the envelope, because we're not having too many of them in the spaces that really matter.
This is my last major statement, because I don't, we're getting ready to go soon. First of all, I want to applaud all young people for one thing that's really important. You have made something like this laptop, something like this phone, something like this ring light, and you have created a whole new body of work by millions and billions of bodies of work. So we will get to a point of where there's enough out there, even with Quibi and all these other things out there, that more and more materials are going to be produced, and more we get to see our art, our music, our voices. But the biggest thing I would like to see as an old head is I want to see our joy again. Because no matter what the struggle was or the stereotype, my greatest moment is still seeing you smile, seeing you get up, seeing you celebrate that you're achieving something, and seeing you dust yourself off. That is still, for me, what motivates me, you know, make me walk an extra block or go help somebody else out. Because that's what got my grandparents through. That's what got the slave to escape. That's got the person to fight, like Nat Turner. That's got folks back in the motherland wondering when we coming home. We are people of joy.
Yeah, I've never.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I was gonna say I've never put too much credence in entertainment broadly, because it, you know, covers the gamut from sports to the small screen to the big screen to the stage and so much more. So like I was saying, Jackie Robinson is certainly inspirational, but Jesse Owens, that's entertainment, that's sports, that's here to bring you joy by watching it. I think Shaft, although it's a blaxploitation film, I find inspiration in that. I also like Superfly and the Mac, but people think that those are not good examples, considering they're focused around drug dealers at the same time. You know, I like Coffee, but she does kill a lot of people. You know, some people would say that that's not inspirational. Or if you go back, Marvin Gaye started singing soul music. His father didn't like it, thought he was singing the devil's music. It cost Marvin Gaye his life. You know, same thing with Mahalia Jackson. You listen to her first Christmas album, it's very down, it's very solemn. She's singing like Jesus died yesterday. When the record label says, Mahalia, we got to sell a couple of records here, and you got to step this up. Took her up to Chicago. It sounds totally different. All the songs you know are nothing like her first Christmas album. They are, you know, Joshua's building that wall. Now, Joshua's going into battle, but when you hear Mahalia sing it, you like, come on, Joshua, you're ready. You know, and a big part of entertainment now, I'd say, so, and our singers come through the Black church. You know, this is a very solemn occasion, very sacred. It's from the church, but we can turn that into entertainment. And some people are anti that, are anti what the church has become, are anti what film has become, and anti what entertainment and sports have become, particularly the violence, the word violence associated with the NFL. Some of our greatest, you know, inspirational people, from Jim Brown to others, have come through that. And then sometimes even music is bastardized. I'm thinking of a song, Hard Out Here for a Pimp, wins a Grammy Award. People were like, how is that even possible? That song is trash. It should have won nothing. And here, I'm going to say some people give it an award of any kind. So in entertainment, and just like, say, if I was an Italian American, I might be anti The Godfather, anti The Sopranos, anti Jersey Shore. See it as complete trash. You know, so I think entertainment should have a responsibility, but I don't expect it to have any. They'll basically produce anything that sells. Just like on TV itself, most people don't want to watch C-SPAN for the news. You want it with a little more, you know, a little more flavor.
Yeah, and actually to add to that point too, Mr. Williams, yeah, it's funny when you talk about that, because you're right, it's about what sells. Because I was thinking the other day about, you know, we have all of these reality TV shows, and you know, specifically I found it interesting, the dichotomy of, we have this show called Mob Wives, right? And it literally talks about these women they've come together and they are defending their father's actions about how many people they've killed on national TV. But you don't see Crip Wives and Blood Wives and Latin King Wives. You don't see that. So I'm like, That is so interesting how this is literally illegal classified information that was once sealed by the federal government, and now it's a TV show. But on the opposite end, our people are still being locked up and getting our charges extended for crimes that were found out to be committed 15, 20 years ago. So again, the stereotype is not just embedded in the family, the culture, but it's systemic. And that's the bigger conversation, is how do we continue to make sure that we, as those exceptions to the rule, change the fabric of what it means to be a person of color, right? Because at that point, and only at that point, are you able to have those conversations to say, we're cutting this out completely. And you're not gonna refer to us in this way. And it's crazy that you can glorify this one group of women just because of their skin color, but then just completely forget the others that exist, and the children that their parents have left behind, and the students that they're going to, the school systems, the places that they come from, that are affected by the negative popularity that comes to from these shows. Again, it goes both ways, right? Because like you said, at what point is it just entertainment? But is it really entertainment if it really does translate into how people really live their lives? That's why they call it reality TV, even though it's scripted.
Right. I think it actually goes back to a point that or a couple of points that Michael Slater brought up before, this idea of a critical mass. I think maybe Aaron brought up Black Power, but Michael Slater also brought up self-love. And I really do think that one of the ways, because you had asked before, like, how can people create positive change in these spaces? Like, to bring up your example about like kids coming in and having obviously put off their homework for like watching like Love and Hip Hop. It's like part of it is, and to just do a little like wordplay on the critical mass, is sometimes like one of the reasons why like people get surprised all the time that I really like essentially like the more popular version of gangsta hip hop nowadays, which is called trap music for those who don't know. Like people get really shocked. They're like, oh, they hear that I went to like U Chicago, or they hear the way that I speak, or maybe the way I dress. I'm like, wait, you like trap music? And I truly love approaching trap music with like the most like as highbrow of a critique as I could like ever approach such music, because I think like, you know, it's still art. Like, so that's what you do with art. You critique it. And, you know, like the best way I know how to critique it is like things where I've learned like from people critiquing like maybe Alfred Hitchcock movies or stuff like that. And so I think like one of the ways like you can get some use out of like if your kid is not done the reading and they've watched this reality show, is like you dissect the decisions with them. It's like, okay, well, now we're going to learn like about the philosophy and ethics of these decisions. Like, what do you think about, like, how do you think of this relationship? Like, what makes a character a villain in this show? What makes a character good? Like, how does that get reflected? Like, I used to tutor a lot when I was in Chicago, and all the time, you know, like I would figure out, like if for math homework, I would figure out if the kids played sports, or I'd figure out what games they played, you know, like what either video games or tabletop games. And that's how I would do all the math examples. And then in terms of like, mostly like the language arts was just like basic grammar and writing, but that was the other way I would like try to get them, you know, to like, because you always have to get them to relate to it, or else, like you said, if they figure out like what's on the TV or YouTube, or like what games are more fun or you know, more relatable than just regular schoolwork, like you'll never get them to just use it as just procrastination, and it'll just be what they do.
Really, really quickly, Freddie, and what you're talking about is building a genuine connection, and that's exactly what is necessary. But unfortunately, parents, specifically in urban environments, have 2 or 3 jobs and are completely unwilling, or not even that they're unwilling, because most parents want to help their students. They want to be able to sit, watch a show, dissect it, figure it out, and put it in a way that their students can understand. But they just not only don't have the time, but some of them just really don't care, right? So you're the students, and again, this is across the board, not just with students, but living and breathing adults as well. They really, it's as simple as they make time for what they want, right? And if you're not making time to sit and talk to your child about what they're ingesting from the TV or computer screen, you're not going to ever know how to connect with them, let alone how to help them with assignments that would bridge the gap between what they're watching and what they need to be learning. It's just really hard to do. But yeah, you're absolutely right. When you build those connections, you're able to take and invest their time, because what's interesting and my educators on the line will tell you is that's why I love kids and students, because they're the first, is as soon as the adult walks in the room and they're able to say, nah, he's not here for me, right? They're just such good judges of character that it's almost scary. It's like, how did you know that? Because I couldn't even see that until 2 months later. Like, but they get it. And so that's another thing that I would recommend too. And I promise I'm done soon. That I would recommend that people just listen to kids. Listen to what they're saying, because sometimes kids are grabbing at you like, they think you're big toys because that's technically what you are to them, right? But sometimes they're saying something that you need to hear. And it may not be about politics, or it may not be about what you're going through at work, but it can be, hey, my teacher said this really inappropriate thing to me today, and I need some help with this. What? Like, and those are the reasons why we need to begin to have those really specific and really intense conversations. People just feel like, well, they're kids, and when they get grown, we'll figure it out. By that point, it's too late, and they don't want to talk to you.
So we're gonna end it with a Q&A.
Okay.
Well, these two questions that came in that I think they're a good place to end, and I'd love to hear from everybody. So first, how can we teach our children to overcome, knock down the walls that stereotypes create? And I believe we were like speaking on that before, like with the connecting to them, speaking to them, letting them have their voice. But if anybody would like to elaborate further, please.
Can you just repeat the question one more time?
How can we teach our children to overcome or knock down the walls that stereotypes create?
I'll take a stab at it with a 30-year-old and two 25-year-old twins that always lived in both coasts and all over the place, and two academic parents that, first of all, there's no manual, so let me get that out of the way. You know, every parent that ever exists was doing the best they could do under the most outrageous situations. And then you wake up and find out they're smart and neurotic. But the first thing you do is you constantly reinforce the simplest thing my father says: nobody's better than you, but you're not better than anybody else. Whatever you got to do, the world doesn't owe you. Chris Rock talked about it. Your mama might be lying too, but you got to pick yourself up. So it's a matter of balance between truth telling and building up. You got to tell them the truth, because they're going to find out. They can tell you lying. My kids never knew about Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny, because we weren't having it. No chubby dude was coming through no chimney in my house. That wasn't me. The truth telling started as early as those kind of things. But the other thing about it was surround them around people who mean them well. The more people they're around, my oldest son is dyslexic and also was number 6 in the country in Taekwondo. The Robinson family that taught him Taekwondo was part of that village. They were African Americans, both graduated from U of Penn, and they moved to this little place in Virginia and opened up 2 studios and coached people to the Olympics. And it doesn't have to be that. It could be somebody at the roller skating rink. It could be the bowling alley. It could be a basketball coach. It could be the dance instructor. It's a community of people. And also recognize it could be the boys club, the girls club. Those of us who survived Newark back in the day, we had lots of activities and lots of people. I'm not saying go backwards, don't go backwards. But make sure there's a community that they got more than one person to talk to. Kids aren't stupid, they're really brilliant. Figure out how dumb we are really quick.
And that was literally my point. I was literally going to say, just to simplify it and wrap it up, is that the problem with, not the problem, but the reason why students today have such a difficulty learning from people that generally don't care about them. First of all, that's the reason, because they know that they generally don't care. But students are at a point where they're like, we know more than you. We know you. This virtual learning thing, they're like, we've been doing this. This is not new to us. This is new to you all. And now we have to wait 2 weeks for you to figure it out so that we can talk to you about the stuff that we were supposed to learn 2 months ago. Like they're tired. And then and then specifically from students in districts where the students are dealing with all these different issues, they're hungry, they're tired. Their parent was just locked up last night for a domestic violence issue. Like their cousin was shot down the street from the school that they go to. Like these are a way to have them break down stereotypes, and a way to have them curb them, because if they can't break them down, they can curb them, is by empowering them and by being an advocate for them, right? Stepping in when you know that students, and again, I have one of my, Shelly Sanders, she's on the call. She's not only a Zeta, shout out to the Blue and White family. She's not only a Zeta, but she's also an educator in the school district that I work in, and she works directly for the programs that I operate in the school district. Me and her, I've developed this student voice and choice thought process, right? We need to be able to listen to them to be able to provide for them. And if we can't have a conversation with them, they won't react or take in anything. So being able to empower them, be an advocate for them, and make sure that they understand that you're there for them will go more further than anything that you can do monetarily, anything that you can do for them via a virtual space, because now it's even more difficult, because usually proximity is a way that people connect. Without that, some people are like, well, I'm just going to close my camera. What are you going to do about it? So being an advocate and definitely going ahead and voicing your opinion for them definitely will help with helping them curb some of those stereotypes.
Freddie Horner, do you have something to say?
Yeah,
no.
I think
Go for it, Brother Williams.
I think it's important for young people too, or any individual, not to measure by yourself by what others may reflect on you or try to put stereotypes people are trying to put on you, or whatever limitations on you. I think just based on my job, you know, a person that reads Excel sheets for a good 8 hours a day, I think I'm more stoic than other individuals. I don't think literally anybody could tell me anything besides my wife that I would really care that much, you know, beyond a very short period of time. I mean, it really means like nothing to me, you know, and you can only do the best you can do, and that's all you can do. You know, to piggyback on what was said earlier, you know, it's self-love, but it's also self-awareness as well, you know. But yeah, I think it starts internally if you allow people to get under your skin and kind of rock you.
Yeah, I was actually going to go just about in that direction, where it's like, you know, part of it is just this idea of you have to teach your child to not really care about like what others think, you know, like that their identity is really their own. I mean, that's gonna be rough, because like, you know, they're going to get their like heart broken by their little friends who it's like, oh, this person's so cool, and then they'll find out like, oh, but they want me to really conform to like, you know, this particular thing for me to be authentic to them. But you really, like, the tricky thing about authenticity is the only way to be authentic is by like really following your own self. Like, you can't be authentic for other people. So like, that's, you've really got to teach them one, like, in terms of like portraying their own stereotypes on others, is not just the exposure, but they have to have an open mind, because like you can be exposed to a lot of things, and then if you still have a closed mind, you're just going to be using that to justify, like, confirm your own biases. But then on the other hand, to protect them from like outsider stereotypes and being imposed on them, you've really got to, you know, make them, you've just got to empower them to the point where eventually they become like self-sufficient in their own creation of their identity.
That was phenomenal. I definitely want to thank all of the panelists for coming out here to the first Dare to Know. Nadine, do you have any words to close us out? This was phenomenal. Again, I love the discussion. I am upset that I was the moderator. I know I let myself out a few times. I'm sorry. It was exhilarating.
Definitely don't apologize, Aaron. You have so many good points to give, but I really do want to thank everyone who was able to come. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Especially thank you so much to the panelists. You guys were so amazing, and you guys gave great points, and you just gave us all a lot to think about, and hopefully a lot to look forward to in the future. So thank you all so much, and I hope you all have a great Sunday. All right, bye everyone.
Thank you all. Take care.
There you go.
Be safe. Stay safe out there.
Thank you.
You too, guys.